Part 2 of The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen. The whole night they were occupied in weaving a net of the pliable willow bark and tough reeds. It was great and strong. On this net Eliza lay down, and when the sun rose, her brothers were changed into wild swans. They seized the net with their beaks and flew with their beloved sister, who was still asleep, high up towards the clouds. The sunbeams fell exactly upon her face, so one of the swans flew over her head that his broad wings might overshadow her. They were far away from the shore when Eliza awoke. She was still dreaming. So strange did it appear to her to be carried high in the air and over the sea. By her side lay a branch with beautiful ripe berries and a bundle of sweet-tasting roots. The youngest of the brothers had collected them and placed them there for her. She smiled at him thankfully, for she recognized him. He it was who flew over her and shaded her with his wings. They were so high that the greatest ships they descried beneath them seemed like white seagulls lying upon the waters. A great cloud stood behind them. It was a perfect mountain, and upon it Eliza saw her own shadow and those of the 11 swans. There they flew on, gigantic in size. Here was a picture, a more splendid one than she had ever yet seen. But as the sun rose higher, and the cloud was left further behind them, the floating shadowy images vanished away. The whole day they flew onward through the air, like a whirring arrow, but their flight was slower than it was wont to be, for they had their sister to carry. Bad weather came on. The evening drew near. Eliza looked anxiously at the setting sun, for the lonely rock in the ocean could not be seen. It seemed to her as if the swans beat the air more strongly with their wings. Alas! She was the cause that they did not advance fast enough. When the sun went down, they must become men and fall into the sea and drown. Then she prayed a prayer from the depths of her heart, but still she could descry no rock. The dark clouds came nearer, in a great black threatening body, rolling forward like a mass of lead, and the lightning burst forth from flash upon flash. Now the sun just touched the margin of the sea. Eliza's heart trembled. Then the swans darted downward so swiftly that she thought they were falling. But they paused again. The sun was half hidden below the water, and now for the first time she saw the little rock beneath her, and it looked no larger than a seal might look thrusting his head forth from the water. The sun sank very fast. At last it appeared only like a star, and then her foot touched the firm land. The sun was extinguished like the last spark in a piece of burned paper. Her brothers were standing around her, arm in arm, but there was not more than just enough room for her and for them. The sea beat against the rock and went over her like a small rain. The sun glowed in continual fire, and peal on peal of thunder rolled. But the sister and brothers held each other and sang psalms from which they gained comfort and courage. In the morning twilight, the air was pure and calm. As soon as the sun rose, the swans flew away with Eliza from the island. The sea still ran high, and when they soared up aloft, the white foam looked like millions of white swans swimming upon the water. When the sun mounted higher, Eliza saw before her, half floating in the air, a mountainous country with shining masses of ice in its water, and in the midst of it rose a castle, apparently a mile long, with row above row of elegant columns, while beneath waved the palm woods and bright flowers as large as mill wheels. She asked if this was the country to which they were bound, but the swans shook their heads. For what she had beheld was the gorgeous, ever-changing palace of Fata Morgana, and into this they might bring no human beings. As Eliza gazed at it, mountains, woods, and castle fell down, and 20 proud churches, all nearly alike, with high towers and pointed windows, stood before them. She fancied she heard the organ sounding, but it was the sea she heard. When she was quite near the churches, they changed into a fleet sailing beneath her, but when she looked down, it was only a sea mist gliding over the ocean. Thus she had a continual change before her eyes, till at last she saw the real land to which they were bound. There arose the most glorious blue mountains, with cedar forests, cities, and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat on the rock in front of a great cave overgrown with delicate green trailing plants, looking like embroidered carpets. "Now we shall see what you will dream of here tonight," said the youngest brother, and he showed her to her bedchamber. "Heaven grant that I may dream of a way to release you," she replied. And this thought possessed her mightily, and she prayed ardently for help. Yes, even in her sleep she continued to pray. Then it seemed to her as if she were flying high in the air to the cloudy palace of Fata Morgana, and the fairy came out to meet her, beautiful and radiant, and that the fairy was quite like the old woman who had given her the berries in the wood, and had told her of the swans with the golden crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be released," she said, "but have you courage and perseverance? Certainly water is softer than your delicate hands, and yet it changes the shape of stones. But it feels not the pain that your fingers will feel. It has no heart, and cannot suffer the agony and torture that you will have to endure. Do you see the stinging nettle which I hold in my hand? Many of the same kind grow around the cave in which you sleep. Those only, and those that grow upon churchyard graves, are serviceable. Remember that. Those you must pluck, though they will burn your hands into blisters. Break these nettles into pieces with your feet, and you will have flax. Of this you must plait and weave 11 shirts of mail with long sleeves. Throw these over the 11 swans, and the charm will be broken. But recollect well, from the moment you begin this work until it is finished, even though it should take years to accomplish, you must not speak. The first word you utter will pierce your brothers' hearts like a deadly dagger. Their lives hang on your tongue. Remember this." And she touched her hand with the nettle. It was like a burning fire, and Eliza woke with a smart. It was broad daylight, and close by the spot where she had slept lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She fell upon her knees and prayed gratefully, and went forth from the cave to begin her work. With her delicate hand she groped among the ugly nettles. These stung like fire, burning great blisters on her arms and hands, but she thought she would bear it gladly if she could only release her dear brothers. Then she bruised every nettle with her bare feet and plaited the green flax. When the sun had set, her brothers came, and they were frightened when they found her dumb. They thought it was some new sorcery of their wicked stepmother's. But when they saw her hands, they understood what she was doing was for their sake, and the youngest brother wept, and where his teardrops fell, she felt no more pain, and the burning blisters vanished. She passed the night at the work, for she could not sleep till she had delivered her dear brothers. The whole of the following day, while the swans were away, she sat in solitude, but never had time flown so quickly with her as now. One shirt of mail was already finished, and now she began the second. Then a hunting horn sounded among the hills, and she was struck with fear. The noise came nearer and nearer. She heard the barking dogs, and timidly she fled into the cave, bound into a bundle the nettles she had collected and prepared, and sat upon the bundle. Immediately a great dog came bounding out of the ravine, and then another, and another. They barked loudly, ran back, and then came again. Only a few minutes had gone before all the huntsmen stood before the cave, and the handsomest of them was the king of that country. He came forward to Eliza, for he had never seen a more beautiful maiden. "How do you come hither, you delightful child?" he asked. Eliza shook her head, for she might not speak. It would cost her brothers their deliverance and their lives. And she hid her hands under her apron so that the king might not see what she was suffering. "Come with me," he said. "You cannot stop here. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in velvet and silk and place a golden crown on your head, and you shall dwell in my richest castle and rule." And then he lifted her on his horse. She wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I only wish for your happiness. One day you will thank me for this." And then he galloped away among the mountains with her on his horse, and the hunters galloped at their heels. When the sun went down, the fair regal city lay before them, with its churches and cupolas, and the king led her into the castle, where great fountains plashed in the lofty marble halls, and where walls and ceilings were covered with glorious pictures. But she had no eyes for all this. She only wept and mourned. Passively she let the women put royal robes upon her, weave pearls in her hair, and draw dainty gloves over her blistered fingers. When she stood there in full array, she was dazzlingly beautiful, so that the court bowed deeper than ever, and the king chose her for his bride, although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the beauteous fresh maid was most certainly a witch, who blinded the eyes and led astray the heart of the king. But the king gave no ear to this, but ordered that the music should sound, and the costliest dishes should be served, and the most beautiful maidens should dance before them. And she was led through the fragrant gardens into glorious halls, but never a smile came upon her lips or shone in her eyes. There she stood, a picture of grief. Then the king opened a little chamber close by where she was to sleep. This chamber was decked with splendid green tapestry, and completely resembled the cave in which she had been. On the floor lay the bundle of flax which she had prepared from the nettles, and under the ceiling hung the shirt of mail she had completed. All of these things one of the huntsmen had brought with him as curiosities. "Here you may dream yourself back in your former home," said the king. "Here is the work which occupied you there, and now in the midst of all your splendor, it will amuse you to think of that time." And when Eliza saw this that lay so near her heart, a smile played around her mouth, and the crimson blood came back into her cheeks. She thought of her brother's deliverance and kissed the king's hand. And he pressed her to his heart and caused the marriage feast to be announced by all the church bells. The beautiful dumb girl out of the woods became queen of the country. Then the archbishop whispered evil words into the king's ear, but they did not sink into the king's heart. The marriage was to take place. The archbishop himself was obliged to place the crown on her head, and with wicked spite he pressed the narrow circlet so tightly upon her brow that it pained her. But a heavier ring lay close around her heart, sorrow for her brothers. She did not feel the bodily pain. Her mouth was dumb, for a single word would cost her brothers their lives, but her eyes glowed with love for the kind, handsome king, who did everything to rejoice her. She loved him with her whole heart, more and more every day. Oh, that she had been able to confide in him and tell him of her grief. But she was compelled to be dumb and to finish her work in silence. Therefore, at night, she crept away from his side and went quietly into the little chamber, which was decorated like the cave, and wove one shirt of mail after another. But when she began the 7th, she had no flax left. She knew that in the churchyard nettles were growing that she could use, but she must pluck them herself. And how was she to go out there? "Oh, what is the pain in my fingers to the torment my heart endures," thought she. "I must venture it, and help will not be denied me." With a trembling heart, as though the deed she proposed doing had been evil, she crept into the garden in the moonlight night, and went through the lanes and through the deserted streets to the churchyard. There, on one of the broadest tombstones, she saw sitting a circle of lamias. These hideous wretches took off their ragged garments, as if they were going to bathe. Then, with their skinny fingers, they clawed open the fresh grave. With the fiendish greed, they snatched up the corpses and ate the flesh. Eliza was obliged to pass close by them, and they fastened their evil glances upon her. But she prayed silently and collected the burning nettles and carried them into the castle. Only one person had seen her, and it was the archbishop. He was awake while others slept. Now he was sure his opinions were correct, that all was not as it should be with the queen. She was a witch, and thus she had bewitched the king and the whole people. In secret he told the king what he had seen and what he feared. And when the hard words came from his tongue, the pictures of the saints in the cathedrals shook their heads as though they could have said it. "It is not so. Eliza is innocent." But the archbishop interpreted this differently. He thought they were bearing witness against her and shaking their heads at her sinfulness. Then 2 heavy tears rolled down the king's cheek. He went home with doubt in his heart, and at night pretended to be asleep. But no quiet sleep came upon his eyes, for he noticed that Eliza got up. Every night she did this, and each time he followed her silently and saw how she disappeared from her chamber. From day to day his face became darker. Eliza saw it, but did not understand the reason. But it frightened her. And what did she not suffer in her heart for her brothers? Her hot tears flowed upon the royal velvet and purple, and they lay there like sparkling diamonds, and all who saw the splendor wished they were queens. In the meantime, she had almost finished her work. Only 1 shirt of mail was still to be completed, but she had no flax left, and not a single nettle. Once more, for the last time, therefore, she must go to the churchyard, only to pluck a few handfuls. She thought with terror of the solitary wandering and of the horrible lamias, but her will was firm as her trust in Providence. Eliza went on, but the king and the archbishop followed her. They saw her vanish into the churchyard through the wicket gate, and when they drew near, the lamias were sitting upon the gravestone as Eliza had seen them. And the king turned aside, for he fancied her among them, whose head had rested against his breast that very evening. "The people must condemn her," said he. And the people condemned her to suffer death by fire. Out of the gorgeous regal hall she was led into a deep, dark, damp cell, where the wind whistled through the grated window. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her a bundle of nettles which she had collected. On this she could lay her head, and the hard burning coats of mail which she had woven were to be her coverlet. But nothing could have been given her that she liked better. She resumed her work and prayed without. The street boys were singing jeering songs about her, and not a soul comforted her with kind words. But towards evening there came a whirring of swans' wings close by the grating. It was the youngest of her brothers. He had found his sister, and she sobbed aloud with joy, though she knew that the approaching night would probably be the last she had to live. But now the work was almost finished, and her brothers were here. Now came the archbishop to stay with her in her last hour, for he had promised the king to do so. And she shook her head, and with looks and gestures she begged him to depart, for in this night she must finish her work, or else all would be in vain, all her tears, her pain, her sleepless nights. The archbishop withdrew, uttering evil words against her, but poor Eliza knew she was innocent and continued her work. It was still twilight. Not till an hour afterwards would the sun rise, and the 11 brothers stood at the castle gate and demanded to be brought before the king. That could not be, they were told, for it was still almost night. The king was asleep and might not be disturbed. They begged, they threatened, and the sentries came. Yes, even the king himself came out and asked what was the meaning of this. At that moment the sun rose, and no more were their brothers to be seen. But 11 wild swans flew away over the castle. All the people came flocking out at the town gate, for they wanted to see the witch burn. The old horse drew the cart on which she sat. They had put upon her a garment of coarse sackcloth. Her lovely hair hung loose about her beautiful head. Her cheeks were as pale as death, and her lips moved silently, while her fingers were engaged with the green flax. Even on the way to death she did not interrupt the work she had begun. The 10 shirts of mail lay at her feet, and she wrought at the 11th. The mob derided her. "Look at the red witch, how she mutters. She has no hymn book in her hands. No, there she sits with her ugly sorcery. Tear it into 1,000 pieces." And they all pressed upon her and wanted to tear up the shirts of mail. Then 11 wild swans came flying up and sat round about her in the cart, and beat with their wings, and the mob gave way before them, terrified. "It is a sign for heaven. She is certainly innocent," whispered many, but they did not dare say it aloud. Now the executioner seized her by the hand. Then she hastily threw the 11 shirts over the swans, and immediately 11 handsome princes stood there. But the youngest had a swan's wing instead of an arm, for the sleeve was wanting on his shirt. She had not quite finished it. "Now I may speak," she said. "I am innocent." And the people who saw what happened bowed before her as before a saint, but she sank lifeless into her brother's arms. Such an effect had suspense, anguish, and pain had upon her. "Yes, she is innocent," said the eldest brother. And now he told everything that had taken place, and whilst he spoke, a fragrance arose as of 1,000,000 roses, for every piece of wood in the pile had taken root and was sending forth shoots. And a fragrant hedge stood there, tall and great, covered with red roses, and at the top a flower, white and shining, gleamed like a star. This flower the king plucked and placed in Eliza's bosom, and she awoke with peace and happiness in her heart. And all the church bells rang of themselves, and the birds came in great flocks. And back to the castle, such a marriage procession was held as no king has ever seen. Thus ends The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen.